Life after the last door closes. Inside Angola's death row reality. The door doesn't slam. It seals. And when it does, time stops behaving like time. Men on Angola's death row don't count days the way the outside world does. They measure life in sounds that repeat, routines that never change, and thoughts that grow louder the longer they are left alone. Some say the sentence isn't death. It's waiting. This is not a story about the crime. It's about what happens after judgment when a human being is left inside a system designed to outlast them. This documentary is created strictly for educational and informational purposes. All scenes, narration, and descriptions are presented in a responsible and respectful manner. No graphic content or harmful behavior is shown or encouraged. This video complies with YouTube's community guidelines, and all sensitive topics discussed are handled with care and neutrality. Viewer discretion is advised due to the real-life nature of prison environments. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd really love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime documentaries like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who would enjoy it too. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories to life. Louisiana State Penitentiary, known as Angola, sits on land once worked by enslaved people. Today, it houses some of the longest-serving inmates in the United States, including one of the nation's most isolated death row populations. This documentary examines life inside Angola's death row, not through spectacle or shock, but through psychological reality. How prolonged isolation reshapes identity, decision-making, memory, and hope. What does it mean to exist in a place where the future is undefined, the past is inescapable, and control over even the smallest choices is gone? To understand that, we have to start with the environment, because before the mind breaks, the environment teaches it how. The space that never lets you leave. A death row cell is not just a room. It's a system. At Angola, death row inmates typically spend 22 to 23 hours a day in their cells. The dimensions are fixed. The routine is fixed. Even the silence has a schedule. Psychologists describe this as environmental deprivation, a condition where stimulation is so limited that the brain begins to change how it processes reality. Over time, the mind fills the gaps. Thoughts loop. Memories replay without permission. Small frustrations expand into overwhelming pressure. Former inmates have described the same pattern again and again. Sleep becomes fragmented. Concentration shortens. Emotional reactions flatten or explode without warning. This is not a failure of character. It's a predictable human response. Research from correctional psychology shows that when autonomy is stripped away completely, when every movement, meal, and interaction is controlled, the brain shifts into survival mode. The goal is no longer growth or rehabilitation. The goal becomes endurance. One former Angola death row inmate described it this way. You stop planning your life. You start planning how to get through the next hour without losing control of your thoughts. What makes death row different isn't just isolation. It's uncertainty. Unlike a fixed sentence, death row exists in limbo. Appeals can last decades. Execution dates can be set, delayed, overturned, then reinstated. The mind never lands. It hovers. This state, what psychologists call chronic anticipatory stress, is one of the most damaging conditions for mental health. The body remains alert, but there is no release, no resolution. And yet, something unexpected begins to happen inside this pressure. Not everyone collapses. Some inmates begin to change in ways that even they don't understand, adapting, restructuring their identity, and finding meaning where none should exist. But that adaptation comes at a cost. And once it begins, it cannot be undone. When the mind rebuilds itself to survive. On death row, the brain does not wait for hope. It looks for stability. When uncertainty stretches across years or decades, the human mind begins doing something subtle and dangerous at the same time. It restructures itself. Not to heal, not to grow, but to survive conditions it was never meant to endure. Psychologists who study long-term isolation describe this as adaptive distortion. The mind bends its own rules to reduce pain. Thoughts narrow. Emotional range compresses. The future becomes abstract, almost unreal, because imagining it hurts too much. At Angola, this process is slow but relentless. Early on, many inmates try to keep their old identities alive. They replay memories, rehearse arguments they would make if given another chance, imagine conversations with people who may never visit again. This stage feels active, even hopeful. But it doesn't last, because memory, without new experiences to anchor it, begins to change. Research in correctional psychology shows that under prolonged isolation, autobiographical memory degrades. People don't just forget details, they lose emotional texture. A childhood home becomes a layout instead of feeling. A loved one's face becomes an outline instead of a presence. Several former death row inmates have described a moment they didn't expect, realizing they could no longer clearly remember the sound of someone they loved laughing. Not because they didn't care, but because the brain, under pressure, had started letting go of what it couldn't maintain. This loss is rarely dramatic. It's quiet, incremental, and once it begins, it accelerates. As the outside world fades, the internal world grows louder. Thoughts that would normally pass, regrets, fears, self-blame, loop continuously. Without interruption, the mind starts treating these thoughts as threats. This is where anxiety shifts into something deeper. Clinical studies referenced by the American Psychological Association show that individuals in extreme confinement often develop hypervigilant cognition, a state where the brain remains constantly alert for danger, even when none is present. Every sound becomes meaningful. Every change in routine feels significant. On death row, that alertness has no outlet. There is nothing to prepare for, nothing to resolve. So the nervous system stays activated day after day, year after year. Over time, this produces symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress, not from a single event, but from prolonged exposure to uncontrollable stress. Some inmates describe sudden emotional numbing. Others experience unpredictable surges of anger or despair that feel disconnected from the moment. Both reactions stem from the same source, a nervous system that has lost its ability to regulate itself. And yet, something else happens alongside this deterioration. Structure becomes sacred. In a place where almost nothing can be controlled, routine becomes identity. The same movements, the same order of tasks, the same mental scripts repeated daily. These rituals are not habits, they are psychological anchors. One Angola inmate, held on death row for over 2 decades, described arranging his cell the exact same way every morning, even though no one else would ever see it. When asked why, he said, "If I don't decide something, then nothing belongs to me." That statement reflects a core principle identified by criminologist Gresham Sykes and later expanded by Craig Haney. The deprivation of autonomy does not just remove choice, it erodes the sense of self. Humans define who they are by what they can decide. Remove decisions long enough, and identity begins to thin. So inmates create meaning where they can. Some turn inward, developing intense, intellectual, or spiritual frameworks. Others become hyper-focused on legal work, even when the odds are minimal. Not because they expect freedom, but because the act of effort itself restores a fragment of agency. But this adaptation carries a hidden cost. The longer the mind operates in survival mode, the less compatible it becomes with normal human interaction. Emotional expression becomes blunted or exaggerated. Social cues dull. Trust erodes. Psychological evaluations of long-term death row inmates show a pattern. Many become deeply introspective, articulate, even calm, but struggle profoundly with unpredictability, noise, or open social environments. This creates a paradox. If an inmate's sentence is overturned or a transfer occurs after years on death row, the very adaptations that kept them alive inside can become liabilities outside. The world moves too fast. Choices feel overwhelming. Freedom feels unsafe. One former inmate described his release from death row as more destabilizing than incarceration itself. On death row, Nothing changed. Out here, everything does. My mind didn't know how to keep up. This phenomenon, sometimes referred to as institutionalization of cognition, is well documented in longitudinal studies conducted by the National Institute of Justice. The brain, once conditioned to extreme predictability, struggles to reintroduce flexibility. And then there's the question most people assume defines death row psychology, the awareness of death itself. Surprisingly, research suggests that constant proximity to execution does not produce constant fear. Instead, many inmates report periods of emotional detachment. Death becomes conceptual, not immediate. Something discussed, postponed, abstracted. This isn't denial. It's preservation. When fear cannot be resolved, the mind learns to mute it. But muting fear also mutes hope. Over time, many death row inmates describe reaching a state where they no longer imagine outcomes at all. Not execution, not release, just continuation. Another day, structured like the last. This state is often misunderstood as acceptance. In reality, it's psychological compression, the narrowing of consciousness to reduce suffering. And this compression doesn't announce itself. There's no clear moment where it begins. It settles in quietly, until one day the inmate realizes they no longer think in years or even months, only hours. This is the mental landscape created by prolonged death row confinement. Not madness, not constant terror, but a reshaped mind, optimized for endurance under conditions of extreme control. And yet, even here, something resists total collapse. Because despite everything, the isolation, the uncertainty, the erosion, some inmates still form attachments, still create meaning, still feel responsibility, which raises a deeper question the system rarely confronts. What does it mean to punish someone for decades in a way that fundamentally alters who they become? And who, exactly, is the punishment for by the time the sentence is carried out? That question doesn't stay theoretical, because eventually, for some inmates, the system interrupts this fragile psychological equilibrium with a transfer, a date, or a sudden change that forces the mind to confront something it has spent years avoiding. That moment is where everything fractures, when the system interrupts survival. For years, the mind on death row learns one essential rule. Nothing changes. That belief is not philosophical, it's functional. It keeps the nervous system from collapsing under constant uncertainty. It allows routines to stabilize thought. It teaches the brain to survive by narrowing its focus. Then the system interrupts it. At Angola, that interruption can arrive without warning. A notice slid under a door, a sudden escort, a transfer order, or a legal update that alters the trajectory of a case that has been psychologically parked for years. To the outside world, these are procedural events. To the death row mind, they are seismic. Psychologists studying long-term confinement have documented a phenomenon known as state-dependent adaptation. When a person adapts to an extreme environment, their psychological balance becomes dependent on the stability of that environment. Disrupt it abruptly, and the coping mechanisms that once protected them begin to fail. This is why moments of change, not prolonged isolation alone, are often when inmates experience the most severe psychological distress. Former Angola inmates have described transfers as uniquely destabilizing, even when the move was perceived as neutral or positive. The reason is counterintuitive. Transfer reintroduces uncertainty into a mind that has survived by eliminating it. The brain, conditioned to predict sameness, suddenly has to process novelty again. Sound or louder. Spaces feel exposed. Interactions multiply. Authority becomes less predictable. Even something as simple as being escorted through unfamiliar corridors can trigger intense physiological reactions. Racing heart, dissociation, intrusive thoughts. This response is not fear in the traditional sense. It is loss of psychological orientation. For years, the inmate's identity has been built around a single environment, a fixed rhythm, a limited social universe. When that universe shifts, the self that depended on it wavers. One former death row inmate recalled being moved after nearly 20 years in the same unit. He described an unexpected reaction, not panic, but grief. It felt like something I'd built to survive was taken from me overnight. I didn't know who I was supposed to be in a new place. That grief is rarely acknowledged by the system, but it aligns with what criminologists call environmental attachment under constraint. Humans form psychological bonds not just with people, but with spaces that provide predictability. Even harmful environments can become stabilizing when they are consistent. When the system disrupts that consistency, the brain struggles to recalibrate. Legal developments create a similar effect. When an appeal advances after years of stagnation, it doesn't immediately produce hope. In many cases, it produces anxiety. The mind, having learned to survive without expectations, resists re-engaging with possibility. Hope reopens emotional pathways that were deliberately closed to reduce pain. Clinical interviews conducted with long-term death row inmates show a recurring pattern. Sudden legal movement often leads to sleep disturbances, increased irritability, and emotional volatility. Not because the news is bad, but because it forces the inmate to imagine outcomes again. Imagining outcomes means reintroducing vulnerability. And vulnerability on death row has been trained out. This creates a psychological double bind. To survive, the inmate must detach. To engage with the legal process, they must reconnect. The mind oscillates between these states, often without conscious control. Another layer complicates this further: social perception. Within the prison, death row carries a distinct identity. It marks a person as separate, not just legally, but socially. Transfers or status changes disrupt that identity, forcing the inmate to renegotiate how they are seen by others and how they see themselves. This renegotiation is cognitively taxing. Studies referenced by the National Institute of Justice indicate that identity disruption under confinement can produce symptoms similar to depersonalization, where individuals feel disconnected from their own thoughts or actions. They describe functioning, but not fully inhabiting themselves. In this state, decision-making becomes difficult. Emotional responses feel delayed or exaggerated. The mind struggles to integrate the old survival self with the new demands placed upon it. What makes this especially troubling is that the system often interprets these reactions as noncompliance or instability, rather than predictable psychological responses to abrupt change. The result is a cycle. The inmate adapts to survive. The system disrupts the adaptation. The resulting distress is treated as a personal failure rather than a systemic outcome. And then there's the most severe interruption of all, the setting of an execution date. Contrary to public assumption, this does not always produce visible panic. In many documented cases, it produces a kind of psychological suspension. Inmates report feeling strangely distant from their own circumstances, as if observing someone else's life. Psychologists refer to this as protective dissociation, a response that allows the mind to endure overwhelming threat by creating emotional distance. But dissociation has consequences. It interferes with memory formation, emotional processing, and social connection. It can persist even if the execution is delayed or overturned, leaving lasting cognitive effects long after the immediate threat has passed. One former inmate described receiving notice of an execution date, followed by a stay weeks later. Instead of relief, he experienced confusion and emotional flattening that lasted years. My mind had already stepped away. When the date disappeared, I didn't know how to step back in. This is the cost of survival under constant threat. Once the mind learns to disengage, it does not easily relearn how to engage. And yet, despite these fractures, many inmates continue to demonstrate moral reasoning, empathy, and self-reflection, often in ways that challenge public assumptions about who death row inmates are. Longitudinal psychological assessments have shown that some individuals exhibit increased introspection and ethical complexity over time. This does not erase responsibility for past actions, but it complicates the narrative that people on death row remain psychologically static. The system, however, rarely accounts for change. Punishment proceeds as if the individual frozen at sentencing still exists unchanged decades later. But the psychological evidence suggests otherwise. The person who adapts to death row is not the same person who entered it, which raises a question that becomes impossible to ignore as transfers, legal shifts, and system interruptions accumulate. If prolonged confinement reshapes the human mind so profoundly, what exactly is being judged? And at what point in time? Because somewhere between the sentence and the interruption, something fundamental happens. The punishment stops being about the past and starts becoming about who the system allows a person to become. That realization doesn't stay abstract. In the next chapter, it collides with something even more destabilizing than transfer or legal change: human connection, and what happens when it re-enters a life designed to function without it. When the door opens, death row doesn't end when the sentence changes. It ends when the mind relearns how to live. Angola's death row shows us something uncomfortable. Punishment doesn't freeze people in time. It reshapes them, slowly, quietly, permanently. The person who enters is never the same person who waits decades later. This isn't about sympathy. It's about reality. When isolation becomes routine, when hope is suspended, and when human connection is rationed, the damage doesn't stay behind bars. It follows the mind, and it transfers into release, into every moment that comes after. The question isn't whether the system is tough. It's whether it understands what it creates. If this documentary changed how you see death row, share your thoughts, respectfully, in the comments. Conversations like this matter. Subscribe for more fact-based, psychological, deep-dive documentaries that go where headlines stop. Because some doors don't just close. They change what it means to be human.